The Trump administration has just done something it thinks will make schools safer. The left thinks that it will discriminate against people of color. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, back in 2014, the Obama administration issued some guidance through the Department of Education telling schools that they should try to not create disparate racial impacts on particular groups of students through their disciplinary policies. In other words, they were seeing that black students or students of color were about 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled from schools as were white students. And so they said schools should be concerned about this, that schools should look for ways that kept students in school to conduct discipline, redemptive discipline, they called it. And the Trump administration has said, forget about it. So they have repealed this guidance. And let me just get right to Stephen Green on this question. Steve, it's clear that in our society, while you may say that there is no institutionalized or legal discrimination against, let's just take black students, so I don't have to use that phrase, people of color, over and over. Yeah. There still exists in the heart of men and women a tendency to favor one's own group and to discriminate against the other. And if you see that that the blacks are experiencing 3 times the rate of suspension and expulsion, don't you think it's a good idea for the federal Department of Education, which after all funds these local school districts to a large extent, to say, look, make sure you're doing this in ways that are not racially discriminatory? And doesn't it make Trump look like a racist now because they're rescinding that guidance?
Well, here's what we don't know. What the racial makeup of the people imposing the discipline is. Are these mostly white teachers that are punishing black students 3 times more often? Or are these schools where most of the faculty is also black and they're punishing their people of their own color 3 times more often simply because they're not behaving as well? But there are leaving race aside, which I think we want to do. We are imperfect beings, but we still want to build that colorblind society. The Parkland shooter, whose name I won't mention because I think it's good policy, who is white though, as I understand it, he slipped through the cracks, the disciplinary cracks created by these Obama guidelines. And I love that rule. You know, it's a nice school. It'd be shame if anything were to happen to it because you weren't following our guidelines, right? And so there is a non-racial aspect to this. If you can't punish anybody because you're afraid of breaking the guidelines, which is apparently what happened in Parkland, then you're going to get tragic, deadly situations, exactly like the one we saw in Broward County, Florida. And this is, maybe one of the whitest school districts in the nation where this happened, thanks to these Obama guidelines. What I would like to see is I'd like to see a lot more charter schools for kids of any race who are, for whatever reason, not as well behaved. I would love to see free schools, charter schools, geared to kids with disciplinary problems. And we've seen how this can work. You know, every Army movie starts the same way. Every American Army movie that has a boot camp sequence is you've got this pack of, young men who are not well behaved and ill-disciplined and all that, and the drill instructor turns them into a disciplined group of men. And maybe we need something like that, not actual boot camp, but maybe we do need specialized charter schools for students who are more trouble than other students, and then other charter schools that are geared to those kids who really want to buckle down and study without so many disruptions. But whatever the case, I'm talking more into the future here. Whatever the case, these Obama era guidelines were a disaster and has nothing to do with race.
Well, Bill, the guidance from the Obama administration did come with some teeth in it, as Steve suggests. There were, basically, if the federal Department of Education saw a disparate racial impact of your disciplinary policies, they could launch a probe. And of course, the federal government does a lot of funding of the local school districts, so that you could, theoretically be on double secret probation if that probe didn't go well. The Trump administration hasn't completely disengaged from the local schools when it comes to that. They said they'll still be keeping an eye on situations where there seems to be overt discrimination in particular cases. They also said that the Department of Education will continue to share best practices and make that information available for best disciplinary practices. It just sounds like they're backing off on that sort of implied threat. But Senator Patty Murray, who is a Democrat, said that the Trump administration's rescinding of the Obama-era guidance makes it harder for blacks to learn and repeals efforts to stop racism. That's certainly how it's going to be played, Bill. If you're speaking to somebody who thinks that way, is there any way that you can persuade them differently?
Sure. Let's just speak some plain old truth here, okay? First of all, being a public school teacher these days, they should be awarded combat pay. There's a lot of things you can have an argument with about teachers' unions. That's an entirely different discussion. But the threat level, the physical threat level in public schools in some neighborhoods in this country are shocking. We're not talking about people sometimes that won't shut up. We're talking about people who stab teachers. We're talking about teachers that walk in the room and cannot gain even the beginning of any kind of a semblance over the class and so on, because discipline has been allowed to fall to these kind of levels. There is no discipline. And when there's no discipline and the teacher tells you to be quiet and there are no consequences for this, why not talk to your friends? But the bigger truth is this. What those guidelines, if I understand them correctly, said was if you have a school that's 30% black, then all of the people who get disciplinary actions, there cannot be more than 30% black discipline cases, because anything more than that is racism, and there you go. This this statement that you just read is a perfect example of this. This is how progressive racism destroys our country. It's very simple. Progressives have said things like, we will give you, if you decide to have children out of wedlock, we'll pay for them. The more of them you have, the more that we will pay. We will not only make it acceptable for you to do this, we'll give you financial incentives to do it. So the number of children raised in single-parent homes has gone right through the ceiling, which almost always, I don't know what the number is, but I'll bet it's nearly 100%, means that these people are going to be raised in a home by their mom. Okay, so you've set up a world where the fathers can simply abandon their families. There's no opprobrium, there's no shame. In fact, it's bragging rights on the street. So now you've got an entire 2 or 3 generations of fatherless boys who are growing up without any sense of discipline at all. Their mothers are overwhelmed. There's any number of pathologies there as well. These kids go to school and they don't know how to do anything other than act out. And now we get to the real crux of the progressive destruction. Because what the progressives are saying is, if there is a problem person in the school and that person is disrupting the classroom, then somehow it's unfair to pull that person out of the classroom because it will deprive him of an education. But what nobody is saying is if you keep him in that school, he's going to deprive 39 other students of an education, and that's the thing they will not face. So since there's no discipline, since there's none of this stuff, everybody's walking on eggshells and they're reinforcing the racism that has caused this in the first place. The left is basically saying that we are not going to hold students to account as individual people committing individual actions. If you're black, then we're going to give you a little shade. We're not going to prosecute. We're not going to investigate as much of this. So what are they basically saying, right? What are they basically saying when Obama comes up with a rule like that? He's basically saying that it's okay for blacks to be more violent than white. And I don't know why he would say that unless they think that is inherently the case. Because if you treat people like individuals, you process the cases against the offenders. And it doesn't matter what the offenders look like. And when you start to have discipline on a level like that, discipline with individuals, you have a microscopic chance of learning something. I went to British private schools for a while, and then I went to Dade County public schools. And I went from a 4.0 average to a 2.1 average very quickly, because it was exceedingly clear to me that knowing the answers to what you were studying and actually learning the material in cases of some of these schools was actually, is actually life-threatening. So until we restore discipline and until we do this kind of fundamental triage that basically says, yes, This person may have an entire history of abuse. They may have been, their parents may have been alcoholics or drug addicts. He may have been beaten, may have been left in all of this. And it's not to take away from the sympathy you would have for somebody coming from a home like that. But when you say that we're not going to discipline this person, we're going to allow them to stay in the classroom and ruin the education of everybody else in the classroom, you're basically once again, it's the progressives, once again, with affirmative action and all the rest of it, once again, it's the progressives that are saying blacks are not good enough to be able to get the same scores as whites. Blacks are more violent than whites are because we can't have a prosecution of an individual student on an individual basis. And so all of this racism comes around, and who gets hurt? Right? Does Nancy Pelosi get hurt? Do these senators get hurt by the condition of these inner city schools? No. The people that get hurt are the people who they claim to be the advocates of. The people who live in these democratically controlled cities, which are just war zones, are the victims of the policies of the Democrats that go out there and tell these people we're your champions, and the Republicans want to put you in chains.
And what a waste of human potential. Generation after generation. Just, ugh.
When I was in 8th grade, my best friend was a kid named Kevin. Kevin was the black kid in a 1,200 student junior-senior high school. And funniest guy I ever knew. We had a ball together. Well, one morning before homeroom, we were horsing around in the, I think it was Miss Wagner's homeroom, and kind of boxing with each other, kind of one of these like, slap fights, you kind of tag each other. And I forget who did what happened, but one of us backed the other guy up against a metal bookshelf, and it fell over, and so all these music books from Ms. Wagner's music classes spilled out onto the floor. At which point, both of us panicked and ran. So we left the room, and then later I slunk into homeroom. Well, we wound up sitting in the office, and the principal, who was in charge of discipline, took Kevin first one-on-one in the room and closed the door. And a little while later, Kevin came out, and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "I'm suspended." And so Kevin walks out of the office. And then I believe it was Mr. Free, the assistant principal at the time, walks out of his office, looks at me, points at me, and says, "Ott, get on the stick," and walked out. That was my discipline.
Damn.
Even at the time, in 8th grade, I thought, wait a minute, we both did the same thing. Clearly, neither one of us was to blame more than the other. I get a hockey analogy, and he gets suspended. It flummoxed me. Now, Kevin may have had a disciplinary track record of which I was unaware and didn't, know what Mr. Free had to deal with him. But in any case, that just seemed like an injustice to me at the time. I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding that people on the left suffer, and many of us on the right as well. You can have equal justice, and you can still treat people as individuals. And I think that was the heart of what Bill was getting at. The challenge here is, can you have equal justice at the local school level without the federal government getting involved in the process? And I've always pushed back on the notion that if you let local people to themselves to govern their own communities and their own schools where their own kids go, they will make poor decisions at the local level regarding the people who are right next door to them. But if you push those decisions upstream so they're 1,200 to 3,000 miles away, somehow those people will make better decisions. Many of those people who send their kids to private schools will make better decisions for your kids in your community. And I reject that idea. I endorse the Obama administration's idea of using disciplinary measures that are aimed at redemption. Obviously, our goal here isn't to try to get a kid out of a learning environment. Our goal here is to restore him so he can function appropriately within a learning environment. But I would say if you want to have a disciplinary protocol that is engaged around giving second chances, then perhaps the federal government ought to do the same for the local school districts and give them a second chance to do discipline right. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.